London, 1813. While other young ladies flutter their fans and simper for masculine attention, Miss Imogen Fairweather commits the unforgivable sin of reading Voltaire at Lady Pemberton's ball. At 23, she has perfected the art of invisibility. Her intelligent hazel eyes and unfashionable love of philosophy marking her as hopeless wallflower material. But when Sebastian Blackwood, the formidable Duke of Ravenshollow, finds himself inexplicably drawn to the corner where she sits absorbed in philosophical discourse, he discovers something that will haunt him through every subsequent social gathering. In a world where beauty and breeding determine worth, one woman's brilliant mind proves more captivating than any diamond tiara. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The crystal chandeliers of Lady Pemberton's ballroom cast their glittering light upon a scene as familiar as it was carefully orchestrated. London's finest had gathered for the opening ball of the 1813 season, a symphony of silk and ambition played out across polished marble floors. Young ladies in their finest muslins and satins moved through the crowd like exotic birds, their feathers carefully preened to catch the eye of eligible gentlemen. Mothers positioned themselves strategically near walls and pillars, their sharp eyes cataloguing every glance, every dance card filled, every whispered conversation that might signal a potential offer. The air thrummed with barely contained excitement, the promise of advantageous matches and romantic conquests hanging as thick as the scent of hothouse flowers that adorned every available surface. Yet beneath this towering arrangement of white roses and trailing ivy, in the furthest corner of the ballroom, sat Miss Imogen Fairweather, as removed from the evening's machinations as if she occupied an entirely different world. Her dove-grey silk gown, modest in its simplicity, and deliberately chosen to blend with the pale wallpaper behind her, marked her as a creature apart from the peacock display surrounding her. While other young ladies employed fans to flutter coquettishly or to shield whispered confidences, Imogen had pressed hers into service as a privacy screen, behind which she had secreted a leather-bound volume of Voltaire's Candide. Her hazel eyes, neither remarkable for their color nor their size, but animated by an intelligence that transformed her entire countenance, moved rapidly across the French text, occasionally pausing as her lips curved in appreciation of some particularly clever turn of phrase. At 23, she had long since accepted her position as the family's confirmed spinster, a fate sealed not by any particular failing of character or appearance, but by the simple mathematics of her situation. The daughter of Baron Fairweather of Millbrook, she possessed neither the fortune that might excuse a plain face, nor the extraordinary beauty that could overcome modest circumstances. Her father's estate, while respectable, provided comfort rather than luxury. And after years of supporting 2 daughters through multiple seasons, the family coffers had grown decidedly light. More damning than her modest dowry, however, was her complete inability to master the art of feminine accomplishments that society deemed essential. She played the pianoforte adequately, but without the passion that might move listeners to tears. Her watercolors were competent but uninspired, her needlework functional rather than decorative. She spoke French fluently and had managed to acquire a shocking amount of Latin through persistent eavesdropping on her late brother's lessons. But such scholarly pursuits were considered more hindrance than help in securing a husband. Indeed, her voracious appetite for reading and her unfortunate tendency to express opinions on matters deemed unsuitable for feminine consideration had earned her a reputation as a blue stocking, that most dreaded of social categories that marked a woman as irredeemably unmarriageable. Just 20 feet away from her sister's self-imposed exile, Miss Cordelia Fairweather held court with the easy grace of one born to command attention. Golden-haired and blue-eyed, with the kind of delicate beauty that inspired poets and reduced strong men to stammering adolescents, she possessed everything that Imogen lacked in terms of conventional feminine appeal. Her laugh rang out like silver bells across the crowded room as she accepted compliments from a circle of admirers that included 2 viscounts, a baronet, and the younger son of an earl. Her dance card had been filled within minutes of her arrival, and already 3 different gentlemen had requested permission to escort her to supper. Mrs. Genevieve Fairweather, their mother, positioned herself where she could observe both daughters simultaneously, though the contrast in their situations required no particular vigilance to monitor. While Cordelia's success demanded careful management to ensure she encouraged the most advantageous suitors without inadvertently discouraging others who might prove useful, Imogen's complete lack of masculine attention required a different sort of maternal attention. Mrs. Fairweather found herself torn between pride in her younger daughter's triumph and despair over her elder's determined march toward spinsterhood. She had long since abandoned hope that Imogen might suddenly develop the kind of vivacious charm that attracted gentlemen, but she continued to harbor the increasingly desperate wish that her daughter might at least make some effort to appear available rather than actively discouraging any potential interest through her obvious preference for books over beaux. The evening's hostess, Lady Pemberton, discovered Imogen in her alcove during one of her periodic tours to ensure all her guests were properly entertained. A kindly woman in her 50s who had known the Fairweather family for years, she regarded the young woman with a mixture of affection and exasperation that had characterized her feelings toward Imogen since the girl's debut 5 years earlier. Reading again. "Imogen," she sighed, settling her considerable bulk beside the girl with a rustle of purple silk. "You'll strain your eyes in this light, dear child? The light is perfectly adequate for Voltaire's wit, my lady," Imogen replied with the gentle smile she had perfected for such encounters, though I confess his observations on human folly are rather illuminated by tonight's proceedings. Lady Pemberton followed the direction of Imogen's glance toward where a notorious fortune-hunter was paying marked attention to a wealthy merchant's daughter, whose father had recently purchased an estate and social aspirations to match. "My dear girl, surely you cannot find Monsieur Voltaire more entertaining than the very real drama unfolding around you." "On the contrary," Imogen said, carefully marking her place in the volume before closing it, "I find his fictional characters considerably more predictable than their living counterparts, which makes for far more restful reading." "You cannot mean to spend the entire evening hiding behind that book," Lady Pemberton persisted. "There are several perfectly pleasant young gentlemen present who might appreciate conversation with an intelligent young woman." Imogen's smile grew more pronounced as she gestured subtly toward the dance floor, where those same pleasant young gentlemen were thoroughly occupied with partners whose conversation consisted primarily of giggles and compliments. "I fear you overestimate both their desire for intellectual discourse and my ability to provide the sort of entertainment they actually seek. I am perfectly content to observe from my corner, my lady. And I assure you, I find the evening quite educational in its own way." Sebastian Blackwood, 5th Duke of Ravenshollow, surveyed the glittering assembly with the detached interest of a naturalist observing specimens in their native habitat. At 31, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that drew every eye in any room he entered, though he had long since ceased to notice or care about such attention. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of aristocratic bearing that spoke of centuries of breeding, his dark hair was arranged in the fashionable wind-swept style, though the effect was achieved through habit rather than vanity. His penetrating blue eyes, striking against his tanned complexion, missed nothing as they catalogued the evening's attendees with the same methodical precision he applied to parliamentary debates or estate management. He had arrived precisely 30 minutes after the appointed hour, late enough to avoid the initial crush of greetings and early enough to demonstrate proper respect for his hostess. Timing that had been calculated rather than accidental. His presence at such gatherings had become increasingly rare over the past 5 years, ever since the spectacular collapse of his engagement to Lady Helena Worthington had convinced him that the marriage Mart held nothing but disappointment and duplicity. Tonight's attendance had been extracted from him only through the persistent nagging of his formidable grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Ravenshollow, who had made it clear that his duty to secure the succession could not be indefinitely postponed. His requirements for a future duchess had been refined through bitter experience into a precise list of qualifications that prioritized practical considerations over romantic sentiment. She must be beautiful enough to grace his arm at state functions and accomplished enough to manage his various households. Her breeding must be impeccable and her dowry substantial enough to demonstrate her family's commitment to the match. Most importantly, she must possess the kind of empty-headed compliance that would ensure she never challenged his authority or complicated his carefully ordered existence with inconvenient emotions or independent thoughts. As his gaze moved methodically across the room, dismissing one glittering prospect after another for various failings, it was arrested by a sight so unusual that he found himself staring with unguarded fascination. While every other young lady in the ballroom employed every artifice at her disposal to attract masculine attention, fluttering fans and batting eyelashes with practiced precision, one figure remained completely absorbed in what appeared to be a book. The novelty of such behavior was so unprecedented in his experience that Sebastian found himself studying the young woman with the same intense focus he might apply to an unexpected parliamentary motion or a particularly complex agricultural problem. Lord Nathaniel Ashford, his closest friend since their days at Eton, materialized at his elbow with 2 glasses of champagne and an expression of barely concealed amusement. "You're staring," Nathaniel observed, with the kind of blunt honesty that their long friendship permitted. Sebastian accepted the offered glass without taking his eyes from the mysterious reader. "Who is that?" he asked, nodding toward the corner where the young woman sat. "Miss Imogen Fairweather," Nathaniel replied after following his friend's gaze with surprise. "Daughter of Baron Fairweather of Millbrook. Pleasant enough family, modest circumstances. The younger sister is considered the beauty of the family." He paused, studying Sebastian's profile with growing amazement. "Good God, you're not actually interested, are you?" Sebastian didn't immediately respond, his attention captured by the sight of Miss Fairweather carefully marking her place in her book before rising to greet an elderly couple with such genuine warmth that her entire countenance seemed transformed. The smile she offered them was radiant in its sincerity, a stark contrast to the polite mask she had worn when younger, more fashionable guests had approached her alcove earlier in the evening. There was something in her manner, a quality of authentic engagement that seemed utterly foreign to the calculated charm that characterized every other interaction he had observed that evening, that intrigued him beyond all reasonable explanation. The following evening at the Countess of Harrington's soirée found Sebastian Blackwood employing a strategy so unprecedented that it would have shocked his grandmother into speechlessness had she witnessed it. Instead of positioning himself in the main drawing room, where eligible young ladies displayed themselves like precious gems awaiting appraisal, he made his way deliberately toward the less frequented corners of the mansion, guided by an instinct that had served him well in both political negotiations and estate management. The Countess, renowned for her extensive library, had thrown open her bookroom to guests, though few availed themselves of the privilege when more glittering entertainments beckoned elsewhere. Sebastian's calculation proved correct when he discovered Miss Imogen Fairweather standing before a glass-fronted cabinet, her attention wholly absorbed by a leather-bound volume she held with the reverent care of one handling a sacred relic. The lamplight caught the rich auburn highlights in her chestnut hair, which had been arranged tonight in a slightly more fashionable style, though she retained the essential simplicity that marked her as different from her more elaborate contemporaries. Her evening dress, a soft blue silk that brought out the golden flecks in her hazel eyes, was cut in elegant lines that suggested her family's improved circumstances without approaching ostentation. She appeared completely unaware of his approach. So engrossed was she in examining what he could now see was a first edition of Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, her face illuminated with the kind of scholarly pleasure that transformed her unremarkable features into something approaching beauty. "You find Johnson's definitions superior to Bailey's?" he inquired softly, moving to stand beside her at a respectful distance that nonetheless allowed him to observe her reaction. The slight start she gave indicated her surprise at his presence, though she recovered quickly, turning to face him with that direct gaze that had first captured his attention. "Indeed, Your Grace, though I confess I find his philosophical observations embedded within the definitions rather more fascinating than their purely practical applications," she replied, apparently oblivious to the impropriety of engaging a duke in serious intellectual discussion without proper introduction. Most young ladies would have simpered and deferred to his superior knowledge, but Miss Fairweather spoke with the confidence of one accustomed to forming and expressing her own opinions. "His definition of patron, for instance, strikes me as particularly pointed, given the circumstances of its composition." Sebastian found himself genuinely smiling for the first time in recent memory, delighted by both her knowledge and her willingness to engage in substantive discourse. "One who supports with insolence and is paid with flattery," he quoted, testing the depth of her understanding. "Quite cutting, particularly given his relationship with Lord Chesterfield and the infamous letter that accompanied the dictionary's completion." Her eyes danced with mischief as she continued the literary reference, clearly relishing the opportunity to discuss ideas with someone capable of following her reasoning. The transformation that overcame her features when animated by intellectual excitement was remarkable, lending vibrancy to her entire countenance and revealing the keen intelligence that her quiet demeanor typically concealed. They moved naturally from Johnson to broader questions of language and literature, their conversation flowing with the ease of old friends rather than new acquaintances. Sebastian discovered that Miss Fairweather possessed not only extensive reading, but genuine insight, offering perspectives on familiar works that illuminated aspects he had never considered. Her observations on Pope's satirical techniques revealed both classical education and original thinking, while her analysis of contemporary political pamphlets demonstrated an understanding of current affairs that would have impressed his parliamentary colleagues. The pleasure of conversing with someone who matched his intellectual interests proved so absorbing that Sebastian lost track of time entirely, a lapse unprecedented in his carefully regulated social interactions. Their exchange continued until Mrs. Genevieve Fairweather appeared in the doorway of the bookroom, her expression reflecting the complex emotions of a mother who finds her least marriageable daughter in intimate conversation with society's most eligible bachelor. Her delight at Imogen attracting ducal attention warred visibly with horror at the unseemly nature of their discourse, creating a succession of expressions that might have been comical under different circumstances. "Imogen, dear," she managed, advancing into the room with the determined smile of one approaching a potentially explosive situation. "I have been looking everywhere for you." "Your Grace," she continued, offering Sebastian a curtsy that managed to convey both respect for his rank and maternal concern for propriety, "I do hope my daughter has not been boring you with her bookish enthusiasms." Sebastian's reply carried just enough warmth to reassure the anxious mother without encouraging excessive hopes. "On the contrary, Mrs. Fairweather, I have found Miss Fairweather's conversation most enlightening. We have been discussing the evolution of English lexicography, a subject on which she demonstrates remarkable knowledge." The diplomatic response satisfied Mrs. Fairweather's immediate concerns, while leaving the door open for future encounters, a balance that Sebastian achieved through years of navigating social complexities. As mother and daughter departed, he found himself already anticipating their next meeting, a realization that would have disturbed him greatly had he allowed himself to examine its implications too closely. Word of Sebastian's unprecedented attention to the peculiar fair-weather girl spread through London society with the velocity typically reserved for scandals of the first magnitude. By the following morning, the betting books at White's Club contained numerous wagers on the duration of the Duke's interest, with odds ranging from skeptical to incredulous, depending on the bettor's assessment of masculine fickleness versus intellectual compatibility. Lord Nathaniel Ashford, observing his friend's transformation with mixture of amusement and concern, found himself fielding inquiries about Sebastian's intentions from every quarter of polite society. The most persistent questioner proved to be Lady Arabella Thornfield, acknowledged diamond of the current season, and the woman whom society had universally expected to become the next Duchess of Ravenshollow. Beautiful in the classical sense with golden hair, cornflower blue eyes, and features that might have been carved by a master sculptor, Lady Arabella possessed every qualification that Sebastian's stated requirements demanded. Her father, the Earl of Westmere, commanded both vast estates and significant political influence, while her mother's connections reached into the highest circles of society. More importantly, she had demonstrated throughout 3 seasons the kind of biddable temperament that suggested she would prove a compliant and decorative duchess, content to manage his households and bear his heirs without troubling him with inconvenient opinions or demands for emotional intimacy. Her shock at finding herself supplanted in ducal favor by a country nobody with intellectual pretensions transformed quickly into strategic calculation. Lady Arabella had not achieved her position as society's acknowledged beauty through passive acceptance of setbacks, and she began immediately to implement a subtle but devastating campaign designed to undermine Miss Fairweather's growing influence. Her methods were too sophisticated for direct confrontation, relying instead on carefully planted seeds of doubt that would flourish in the fertile soil of social prejudice. Whispered comments about intellectual pretensions beyond a woman's proper sphere gradually evolved into more pointed observations about masculine inclinations that rendered a lady unsuitable for marriage and motherhood. The campaign proved particularly effective because it played upon existing prejudices about learned women while stopping just short of actionable slander. Meanwhile, Sebastian found himself experiencing emotions that his carefully controlled existence had not accommodated for years. Social events that had once represented tedious obligations now held the promise of stimulating discourse and unexpected insights. He began timing his arrivals to coincide with moments when Miss Fairweather might be expected to seek refuge from the evening's festivities, developing an uncanny ability to locate her chosen corner regardless of venue. Their conversations ranged across subjects that would have scandalized proper society, from political philosophy to social reform, with Miss Fairweather offering perspectives that challenged his assumptions while respecting his superior experience. One evening at Lady Melbourne's musicale, he found her observing the elaborate courtship rituals with the detached fascination of a natural philosopher studying exotic species. "You disapprove of the marriage, Mart?" he asked, settling beside her on a small sofa positioned to provide optimal viewing of the evening's maneuvering. "I disapprove of reducing human connection to financial calculation," she replied thoughtfully, "though I understand its practical necessities for many families." Her honesty, delivered without coyness or calculation, struck him with unexpected force. Most young ladies would have offered platitudes about romantic love, or deferred to his presumably superior wisdom on such matters. But Miss Fairweather spoke with the directness of one who had observed society's mechanisms without illusion, yet retained compassion for those trapped within them. It seems to me that marriages based solely on practical considerations must produce relationships of mutual disappointment when the participants discover they have nothing beyond convenience to sustain them through life's inevitable difficulties. Sebastian found her perspective both refreshing and disturbing, forcing him to examine motivations he had considered purely rational through the lens of her gentle but penetrating analysis. Sebastian's first formal call upon the Fairweather family at their modest townhouse in Bloomsbury represented a departure from established protocol so significant that his own servants exchanged meaningful glances as they prepared his carriage for the unprecedented journey. The Duke of Ravenshollow did not, as a general rule, pay social calls upon baronets of modest means, particularly not during the fashionable morning hours, when such visits might be observed and remarked upon by society's arbiters of propriety. Yet Sebastian found himself drawn to Russell Square with increasing frequency, ostensibly to borrow volumes from Baron Fairweather's respectable library, but in truth to continue conversations with Miss Imogen that had begun to occupy his thoughts with disturbing regularity. The Fairweather residents, while perfectly respectable, spoke eloquently of genteel financial limitations through details that would escape casual observation, but registered clearly with one accustomed to ducal magnificence. The furnishings, though well-maintained, showed signs of age and careful economy, while the small staff moved with the efficiency of those accustomed to managing multiple responsibilities rather than specializing in single roles. Yet Sebastian discovered a warmth in the unpretentious drawing room that his grand estates had never possessed, a quality of genuine hospitality that transformed modest surroundings into something approaching luxury through the simple expedient of sincere welcome. Baron Fairweather, a scholarly gentleman in his 60s, whose passion for learning had outweighed practical considerations throughout his life, proved a delightful host whose enthusiasm for intellectual discourse matched Sebastian's own. Their conversations ranged across subjects from classical literature to contemporary politics, with the older man demonstrating the kind of broad knowledge that came from genuine curiosity rather than fashionable accomplishment. Mrs. Fairweather, though clearly overwhelmed by the honor of ducal attention to her family, managed the social complexities with graceful determination, ensuring proper chaperoning while allowing sufficient privacy for meaningful conversation. It was during these visits that Sebastian began to understand the true extent of Miss Imogen's remarkable education, discovering that her extensive knowledge came not from the superficial accomplishments deemed suitable for young ladies, but from years of serious study under her father's tutelage. Baron Fairweather had originally intended to educate the son who had died in infancy, but when fate left him with only daughters, he had made the unconventional decision to provide Imogen with the classical education originally planned for his heir. She had studied Latin and Greek, read extensively in philosophy and political economy, and developed the kind of analytical thinking typically reserved for masculine minds. Her writing, which Sebastian discovered when she shyly shared some of her private observations, demonstrated a wit and insight that rivaled the best political satirists of their day, combined with a compassion that elevated her social commentary beyond mere cleverness into genuine understanding of human nature. Sebastian found himself increasingly drawn to her intellectual companionship, seeking her opinion on matters that he would never have discussed with other women of his acquaintance, from agricultural innovations to parliamentary procedures. Their conversations challenged his assumptions while respecting his experience, creating a dynamic of intellectual equality that he had never before experienced with any woman. "You truly believe crop rotation could improve yields on difficult soil?" he asked during one particularly engaging discussion of agricultural reform, his question reflecting genuine interest rather than condescending indulgence. "The principles are sound, Your Grace," Imogen replied earnestly, her excitement at discussing practical applications of theoretical knowledge evident in her animated expression. The challenge lies not in the science, but in convincing tenant farmers to abandon methods their families have employed for generations. Change requires not only proof of benefit, but also compensation for the risks involved in experimentation. Her blend of theoretical understanding and practical wisdom impressed Sebastian profoundly, revealing a mind capable of grasping both abstract principles and their real-world applications in ways that suggested natural aptitude for the kind of complex problem-solving that estate management demanded. The invitation to Lord Nathaniel Ashford's country estate for a weekend party arrived at a moment when Sebastian's growing attachment to Miss Imogen had begun to attract uncomfortable levels of social attention, making the prospect of a few days away from London's scrutiny particularly appealing. Ashford Park, nestled in the rolling hills of Surrey, provided the kind of informal setting that allowed for more natural interactions than the rigid protocols of London ballrooms permitted, while the presence of other guests offered sufficient distraction to mask any particular attention he might pay to Miss Imogen. The party proved pleasantly small and intellectually stimulating, including several of Sebastian's parliamentary colleagues and their wives, along with a careful selection of unmarried guests chosen more for conversational ability than matrimonial prospects. Miss Imogen, accompanied by her parents, seemed to flourish in the relaxed atmosphere, her natural intelligence finding fuller expression when freed from the constraints of formal social gatherings. The days passed in a succession of pleasant activities, from riding and walking to informal musical evenings and spirited discussions of current events that continued long after the ladies would typically have withdrawn. Sebastian found himself anticipating each meal, each planned excursion, each evening's entertainment with an enthusiasm that owed everything to Miss Imogen's presence and nothing to the activities themselves, a realization that might have alarmed him had he allowed himself to examine its implications too closely. On the final evening of their stay, after the other guests had gradually retired following an evening of charades and musical performances, Sebastian discovered Miss Imogen still in the garden, walking slowly along the gravel paths in the warm night air. The moon hung full above the carefully landscaped grounds, casting silver shadows through the ancient oak trees and illuminating the formal parterre with ethereal beauty that transformed the familiar daytime scene into something magical and otherworldly. She moved with the unhurried pace of one seeking solitude rather than company, her pale muslin dress seeming to glow in the moonlight as she paused beside the central fountain to observe the play of water over carved stone. Sebastian approached quietly, reluctant to disturb her reverie, yet unable to resist the opportunity for private conversation in such romantic surroundings, the constraints of proper chaperoning temporarily suspended by circumstances and setting. "You could not sleep either," he observed softly, joining her beside the fountain with careful attention to maintaining appropriate distance, even as every instinct urged him closer to her side. "The evening was too beautiful to waste indoors," she replied, turning toward him with that direct gaze that never failed to stir emotions he had thought permanently dormant. "I find myself reluctant to return to London tomorrow, to resume the pretense that these few days of genuine conversation and companionship were nothing more than pleasant diversion." Her honesty, as always, cut straight to the heart of matters that others would have approached obliquely, forcing Sebastian to confront feelings he had been deliberately avoiding. "You speak as though our friendship must end with the weekend," he said carefully, testing the boundaries of what might be safely acknowledged between them. "I speak as one who understands the limitations that society places upon connections that cross certain boundaries," she replied, with the sad wisdom of one who had observed the world's mechanisms without illusion. "You are a duke, Your Grace, with responsibilities and expectations that require an appropriate duchess, while I am a baronet's daughter whose greatest accomplishment is the ability to discuss Cicero's orations in the original Latin." The gulf between our circumstances cannot be bridged by mutual enjoyment of intellectual discourse. Sebastian felt something shift inside his chest at her words, a recognition that the careful emotional distance he had maintained was crumbling under the weight of accumulated affection and respect that had grown far beyond mere intellectual appreciation. "You never speak of your first engagement," she continued gently, her perceptive nature having noticed the shadows that crossed his expression whenever the subject of marriage arose in general conversation. Sebastian's jaw tightened involuntarily as painful memories surfaced, despite his best efforts to keep them buried. "Lady Helena chose my title over my person," he said finally, the bitterness he had carried for 5 years evident in his voice. "When the Duke of Worthington appeared with superior wealth and precedence, she broke our engagement without compunction or explanation beyond the obvious improvement in her circumstances." "How devastating for your pride," Imogen said softly, her tone free from either pity or judgment. "My pride?" Sebastian turned to her with surprise, struck by the inadequacy of her assessment. "I imagine the blow to your heart was far worse than any social embarrassment," she continued, her perception cutting through his defensive cynicism with the surgical precision of one who understood that wounded pride was often the outward manifestation of deeper emotional injury. The moment of vulnerability, of being truly seen and understood by another human being, overwhelmed the careful restraint Sebastian had maintained throughout their growing acquaintance, sweeping away years of protective isolation in a rush of longing that could no longer be contained or denied. He reached for her without conscious decision, drawing her into his arms with a desperate tenderness that spoke of accumulated loneliness and growing love, finally freed from the prison of social expectation and personal fear, and kissed her with a passion that surprised them both in its intensity and inevitability, pouring into that single connection all the words he had not dared to speak, and all the feelings he had refused to acknowledge, even to himself. The summons arrived with the morning post, delivered by the Dowager Duchess of Ravenshallow's personal footman, whose livery and manner conveyed the gravity of the command within. Sebastian recognized his grandmother's bold script even before breaking the ducal seal, and the terse message requesting his immediate presence at Ravenshollow House carried implications that made his jaw tighten with apprehension. Eleanor Blackwood, the formidable dowager who had guided the family through 3 decades of political and social prominence, possessed a network of correspondence that rivaled the government's intelligence services, making it inevitable that news of his unconventional courtship would reach her Yorkshire stronghold, despite his hopes for discretion. At 72, she retained the commanding presence that had made her one of society's most influential figures during her reign as Duchess, her steel-grey hair perfectly arranged, her black silk mourning dress impeccably tailored, and her pale blue eyes sharp enough to cut diamond. She had orchestrated advantageous marriages for 3 generations of Blackwood offspring, viewing matrimonial alliances as strategic campaigns requiring careful planning and ruthless execution rather than romantic enterprises dependent upon the vagaries of emotion. Her success rate in securing beneficial connections had elevated the family's wealth and political influence to unprecedented heights, making her authority on such matters virtually unquestionable within the ducal household. Sebastian found her ensconced in the formal drawing room of Ravenshollow House, surrounded by the portraits of ancestral duchesses whose painted gazes seemed to reinforce her position as guardian of family tradition, and prepared himself for a confrontation that would test both his resolve and his diplomatic skills. "Sebastian," she began without preamble, her voice carrying the crisp authority that had cowed prime ministers and terrified social climbers for decades, "I have received most disturbing reports regarding your recent conduct in London society." Her pause allowed the weight of disapproval to settle before she continued with devastating precision. It seems you have formed an inappropriate attachment to some country nobody, whose only qualification for your attention appears to be an unseemly fondness for masculine pursuits and philosophical speculation. The characterization of Miss Imogen as a country nobody struck Sebastian like a physical blow, though he maintained his composure through years of training in political negotiation and social diplomacy. His response carried careful control, despite the anger building beneath his calm exterior. Miss Fairweather is the daughter of Baron Fairweather, a gentleman of impeccable reputation and considerable learning, he replied evenly. Her education and accomplishments would grace any household, including a ducal one. The dowager's expression conveyed the kind of disdain typically reserved for particularly offensive social presumptions. Education in a woman is an ornament at best and an impediment at worst when it comes to fulfilling her proper duties as wife and mother, she declared, with the conviction of one whose opinions had shaped society for generations. A duke requires a wife who can advance family interests through strategic connections and political influence, not one who quotes philosophers at dinner parties and frightens eligible bachelors with displays of inappropriate learning. She gestured toward a stack of correspondence on the side table that Sebastian recognized as letters from various social arbiters reporting on his recent activities. I have here detailed accounts of your public conversations with this person, conversations that have become the subject of considerable speculation regarding your intentions and her presumptions. Lady Pemberton writes that you were observed in intimate discourse about Voltaire's social commentary, while the Countess of Harrington reports that you spent an entire evening discussing agricultural theory with a young woman who should have been displaying her accomplishments at the pianoforte instead of expounding upon crop rotation. The dowager's recitation of his sins against social propriety might have been amusing under different circumstances, but Sebastian recognized the serious threat underlying her theatrical displeasure. Lady Arabella Thornfield's campaign against Miss Imogen's reputation proceeded with the methodical precision of a military operation, employing weapons refined through 3 seasons of social warfare and perfected through careful observation of society's most effective character assassins. Her beauty and connections provided access to every influential drawing room in London, while her reputation for wit and fashion made her pronouncements carry particular weight among the women who shaped social opinion through careful gossip and strategic exclusion. The attack began subtly with seemingly innocent observations about the peculiarity of intellectual pretensions in young women, observations that gradually evolved into more pointed commentary about the impropriety of pursuing masculine subjects to the exclusion of feminine accomplishments. Lady Arabella possessed the sophisticated understanding of social dynamics necessary to plant seeds of doubt that would flourish without requiring her direct cultivation, allowing others to draw conclusions that she had merely suggested through carefully chosen words and meaningful silence. The whispers that began circulating through London's most exclusive circles carried the particular poison that accompanied allegations against a woman's fundamental nature and moral character, suggestions that intellectual pursuits might mask underlying deficiencies in those qualities most essential to feminine virtue. Rumors began spreading that Miss Imogen's education had rendered her unwomanly in ways that went beyond mere bookishness to encompass a fundamental unfitness for marriage and motherhood, implications that no respectable family could ignore without risking their own social standing. More damaging still were the increasingly vicious suggestions that her apparent capture of ducal attention must have involved improper conduct, since no woman of such modest attractions and circumstances could otherwise have secured the interest of society's most eligible bachelor through honorable means alone. The gossip took on a life of its own as it passed through the network of society matrons who had invested decades in maintaining rigid standards of propriety and had little sympathy for those who appeared to be circumventing established protocols through unconventional means. Lady Arabella's masterstroke came in the form of a carefully orchestrated conversation at Lady Melbourne's weekly salon, where she expressed concern for Miss Imogen's welfare in terms that managed to sound charitable while delivering devastating blows to her reputation. "I do hope," she said with perfectly modulated sympathy, "that poor Miss Fairweather understands the dangers of encouraging masculine attention through intellectual discourse rather than proper feminine accomplishment. One cannot help but worry that her obvious intelligence might lead her to believe that such unusual methods of securing interest could result in honorable proposals, when experienced observers can see that gentlemen who seek such stimulation in female company rarely consider such women suitable for marriage. The implication that Imogen was being used for intellectual entertainment without serious matrimonial consideration spread through society like wildfire, carrying with it the additional suggestion that she was either too naive to understand her position or too calculating to care about the impropriety of her conduct. Within days, the whispers had evolved into open speculation about whether Miss Imogen Fairweather had compromised herself beyond redemption in a desperate attempt to secure a position far above her natural station. Speculation that no family could withstand without serious damage to their social standing and marriage prospects. The devastating effect of society's disapproval upon Miss Imogen became evident when Sebastian's next attempt to call upon the Fairweather family was met with polite but unmistakably firm refusal from a servant whose manner suggested he had been thoroughly coached in delivering disappointing news to persistent callers. Miss Fairweather was indisposed, the man explained with the kind of diplomatic vagueness that indicated permanent rather than temporary unavailability, and Mrs. Fairweather was not receiving visitors due to family concerns that required privacy and discretion. Sebastian's subsequent attempts to encounter Miss Imogen at the social events where she had previously appeared met with similar frustration, as she had apparently withdrawn entirely from public gatherings, leaving behind only whispered speculation about her reasons for such sudden invisibility. The Fairweather family's absence from Lady Pemberton's musicale, the Countess of Harrington's card party, and Lord Melbourne's political salon created a conspicuous void that Sebastian felt with increasing desperation, his careful social composure beginning to crack under the strain of separation from the woman who had come to represent everything he valued in human companionship. His own presence at these events became perfunctory, his attention wandering from conversations that had once engaged his interest, his responses growing curt when well-meaning friends attempted to introduce him to other eligible young ladies who might provide suitable alternatives to his problematic attachment. Lord Nathaniel Ashford, observing his friend's deteriorating spirits with growing concern, finally confronted him about the situation during a particularly dismal evening at White's Club, where Sebastian had spent 3 hours staring into the fire without speaking or acknowledging the presence of other members. "You look like a man attending his own execution," Nathaniel observed, settling into the chair opposite Sebastian with 2 glasses of brandy and the determined air of one prepared for a difficult conversation. "If you continue in this manner, the betting books will include wagers on whether you'll waste away entirely from unrequited attachment or simply expire from sheer misery." Sebastian accepted the offered glass without enthusiasm, his thoughts clearly elsewhere despite his friend's attempt at levity. "She won't see me," he said finally, his voice carrying the kind of defeat that Nathaniel had never heard from the confident Duke who had dominated parliamentary debates and social gatherings with equal aplomb. "Her family claims she's indisposed, but I suspect she's been advised that continued association with me would damage her reputation beyond repair." The bitter irony in his tone reflected his understanding that his attention, intended as the highest compliment he could offer any woman, had instead become a source of scandal and social persecution that made Miss Imogen's life unbearable. Meanwhile, in the modest drawing-room of the Fairweather residence, Imogen sat surrounded by the books that had once provided solace and escape, but now seemed to mock her with their inability to transport her thoughts away from the man whose absence had created a void that no amount of reading could fill. Mrs. Fairweather's anxious hovering reflected her genuine concern for her daughter's welfare, combined with practical worry about the scandal's potential impact on Cordelia's own marriage prospects, creating an atmosphere of tension that made the once comfortable household feel like a prison rather than a refuge from society's cruelties. Lady Arabella Thornfield's final gambit emerged from the kind of desperation that transforms rational beings into creatures capable of unimaginable cruelty. Her carefully cultivated facade of civilized behavior cracking under the pressure of watching her most cherished ambitions slip beyond reach, despite every weapon in her considerable arsenal having been deployed against her rival. The Duke of Ravenshallow's continued devotion to Miss Imogen Fairweather, evidenced by his obvious misery during their separation and his complete lack of interest in other eligible prospects, had forced Lady Arabella to confront the unthinkable possibility that her destiny as a duchess might require more drastic measures than refined social warfare could provide. Her connections within London's most exclusive circles had furnished her with detailed intelligence about the Fairweather family's circumstances, including their financial difficulties, their social isolation, and their desperate need to preserve what remained of their reputation for the sake of their younger daughter's prospects, information that Lady Arabella recognized as potential ammunition in the right hands. The plan she conceived required the services of individuals whose moral flexibility matched their skill with ink and paper, forgers whose talents had served various members of society in matters requiring discretion and deniability, men whose silence could be purchased and whose work could withstand casual scrutiny while serving its devastating purpose. The letters she commissioned were masterpieces of suggestion rather than explicit accusation. Correspondence purportedly between Miss Imogen and a married gentleman of her acquaintance that implied an intimate relationship through carefully chosen phrases and meaningful omissions rather than direct confession of impropriety. Lady Arabella understood that the most effective scandals were those that allowed society's imagination to fill in details that explicit accusations might fail to establish convincingly, creating a web of suspicion that would be impossible to disprove through simple denial. The timing of the letter's appearance demonstrated Lady Arabella's sophisticated understanding of social dynamics, emerging just as London society had begun to tire of speculating about the Duke's unusual courtship and was ready for fresh scandal to enliven drawing-room conversations. The forgeries surfaced simultaneously in multiple households, appearing mysteriously among correspondence that suggested they had been discovered accidentally by servants or inadvertently misfiled by their recipients, creating the impression of widespread circulation that made denial appear futile rather than defensive. Within hours of their emergence, the letters had been examined by society's most influential matrons, who declared themselves shocked but unsurprised by evidence that confirmed their darkest suspicions about Miss Imogen's character and methods, their pronouncements carrying the weight of moral authority that transformed speculation into accepted fact throughout London's interconnected social network. The explosion of scandal that followed the letter's revelation surpassed even Lady Arabella's expectations in its speed and viciousness, spreading through society with the velocity of wildfire, consuming dry timber and leaving devastation in its wake that would require years to repair even if complete vindication could be achieved. Within 24 hours, every drawing room in Mayfair buzzed with horrified discussion of Miss Imogen's supposed transgressions, with each retelling adding new details that transformed mere impropriety into comprehensive moral corruption, deserving of complete social excommunication. The Fairweather family found themselves facing not merely disapproval, but active persecution, with former friends crossing streets to avoid acknowledgement and social invitations ceasing entirely as London's hostesses rushed to protect their own reputations from contamination through association. Mrs. Fairweather, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen her family, took to her bed with nervous prostration that required constant medical attention, leaving Baron Fairweather to manage both his wife's collapse and his daughter's defense, with resources already stretched beyond their limits by years of financial constraint and social climbing. The elderly gentleman, whose faith in his daughter's virtue remained unshakable despite the mounting evidence presented by society's investigators, spoke seriously of removing the entire household to their country estate permanently, abandoning London society rather than continuing to subject his family to persecution that threatened to destroy not only Imogen's prospects, but Cordelia's as well. Miss Cordelia Fairweather, whose golden beauty had made her the season's most sought-after debutante, discovered that scandal's taint extended to innocent family members with ruthless efficiency, her previously crowded drawing room emptying of admirers who could not risk association with a family touched by disgrace. The transformation from social triumph to pariah status occurred with stunning rapidity, leaving the younger Miss Fairweather facing the prospect of spinsterhood through guilt by association rather than any failing of her own, a cruel irony that added family pressure to Imogen's already overwhelming burden of shame and responsibility. Sebastian, learning of the allegations through Lord Nathaniel's carefully delivered report, experienced emotions that ranged from disbelief through fury to cold determination. As he recognized the sophisticated nature of the attack against Miss Imogen's character, and began the kind of methodical investigation that had made him successful in both business negotiations and parliamentary inquiry. His resources, vast and varied, included connections within every level of London society, from the highest drawing rooms to the lowest printing houses, allowing him to trace the letter's origins with detective skills that would have impressed Bow Street's finest investigators. The evidence he uncovered pointing to Lady Arabella's involvement satisfied his own certainty of Miss Imogen's innocence, while simultaneously revealing the calculated cruelty of which society's most beautiful women were capable when their ambitions faced serious threats. Yet his discoveries, however conclusive to his own mind, could not undo the damage already inflicted upon Miss Imogen's reputation, creating a situation where his knowledge of her innocence served only to increase his frustration at his inability to restore her standing in society's estimation through mere revelation of truth that few would accept without independent verification. Standing at the crossroads between personal happiness and social expectation, Sebastian found himself confronting choices that would define not only his own future, but the lives of everyone connected to his decision, the weight of responsibility pressing upon him with suffocating intensity as he calculated the costs of each possible course of action. His grandmother's threats carried real consequence, despite the limitation of entailed inheritance, since her control over the considerable fortune left by his mother could significantly impact his ability to maintain his various estates and political influence, while her social connections could make his life decidedly uncomfortable, even if they could not destroy his position entirely. The Dowager Duchess had made clear that any marriage to Miss Imogen would result in complete estrangement from his family. The withdrawal of financial support that kept several estates profitable, and social ostracism that would undermine his effectiveness in Parliament, where personal relationships often determined political outcomes more than logical argument or factual evidence. His political allies, men whose support had been crucial to his success in advancing agricultural reform and social legislation, expressed grave concern about the impact of marrying a woman touched by scandal upon his ability to influence conservative colleagues who already viewed his progressive ideas with suspicion and would welcome any excuse to dismiss his arguments through attacks upon his judgment and character. Lord Pemberton, one of his most trusted advisers, delivered the harsh assessment with friendly honesty during a private meeting at his club where political realities could be discussed without the diplomatic niceties required in formal settings. "Sebastian, you must understand that politics is largely about perception rather than substance," he said with the weary wisdom of decades spent navigating parliamentary intrigues and social complications. "Your marriage choice will be interpreted as evidence of your decision-making capabilities and moral judgment, fairly or not, and those interpretations will influence how seriously your colleagues take your future proposals on matters of genuine importance to the nation's welfare." The suggestion that his personal happiness must be sacrificed to maintain his political effectiveness struck Sebastian as fundamentally unjust, yet he could not deny the practical truth underlying his friend's warning about the connection between private choices and public influence in a system where personal reputation often carried more weight than logical argument or empirical evidence. Meanwhile, in the suffocating atmosphere of the Fairweather townhouse, where former friends no longer called and creditors grew increasingly insistent about overdue accounts, Miss Imogen received an unexpected proposal that offered escape from disgrace at the price of emotional fulfillment and intellectual companionship. Mr. Reginald Whitmore, a wealthy widower in his 60s, whose first wife had died leaving him with 3 young daughters requiring supervision and education, approached Baron Fairweather with an offer that represented pragmatic solution to multiple problems despite its complete lack of romantic sentiment or mutual affection. Mr. Whitmore, a gentleman of unimpeachable reputation whose fortune derived from successful investments in manufacturing and trade, required a wife capable of managing his household and educating his children rather than providing companionship or passion, making Miss Imogen's intellectual accomplishments an asset rather than a liability in his practical assessment of matrimonial requirements. The proposal, delivered with business-like efficiency through proper channels and accompanied by financial arrangements generous enough to restore the Fairweather family's immediate security, represented everything that Imogen had been taught to value in marriage while offering nothing that her heart actually desired, creating a choice between duty and happiness that reflected the broader conflicts facing women of her generation and social position. The confrontation that would determine their future began when Sebastian, driven beyond endurance by weeks of separation and uncertainty, arrived at the Fairweather residence with the determination of a man who had exhausted patience and diplomatic alternatives in favor of direct action regardless of social consequences or proprietary considerations. His refusal to accept the butler's practiced denials or Mrs. Fairweather's messages of unavailability created a scene that violated every convention of polite society, while demonstrating the sincerity of his intentions through willingness to risk public censure for the sake of honest communication with the woman he loved. The reunion that followed, conducted in the modest drawing room under circumstances far removed from the romantic settings typically associated with such declarations, carried an intensity born of enforced separation, accumulated misunderstandings, and the knowledge that their conversation might represent the final opportunity for honest expression of feelings that social pressure demanded they suppress or abandon. "I would give up everything for you," Sebastian declared with fierce intensity that transformed his usually controlled demeanor into passionate vulnerability as he fought to convey the depth of his commitment despite obstacles that seemed designed to test the limits of human determination and romantic devotion. "I could never ask you to sacrifice your position for my sake," Imogen replied through tears that reflected both joy at his declaration and agony at the impossible choices facing them both, her response demonstrating the selfless love that valued his welfare above her own happiness, while acknowledging the reality that their union would require sacrifices that society would never demand from women of appropriate rank and circumstances. The annual Duchess of Marlborough's Grand Ball represented the pinnacle of London's social calendar, an event whose guest list comprised the most powerful families in England and whose influence extended beyond mere entertainment to shape political alliances and social hierarchies for the coming year. The magnificent ballroom at Marlborough House, adorned with thousands of candles in crystal chandeliers and festooned with flowers imported from the ducal estates, provided a setting worthy of the momentous confrontation Sebastian had planned with military precision and ruthless determination. Lady Arabella Thornfield arrived in triumph, resplendent in ivory silk and family diamonds that proclaimed her confidence in ultimate victory over her provincial rival, her beauty enhanced by the glow of anticipated success as she prepared to accept the Duke of Ravenshollow's inevitable proposal now that Miss Imogen had been effectively eliminated from contention through scandal and social exile. The cream of society had assembled to witness what many expected would be the evening's dramatic conclusion, with Sebastian's marriage intentions finally resolved in favor of the woman everyone had always assumed would become his duchess, despite the temporary distraction of his peculiar fascination with intellectual discourse and unsuitable company. Sebastian arrived precisely at the moment when the evening's festivities reached their zenith. His timing calculated to ensure maximum attendance and attention for the revelation he intended to deliver, with devastating effect upon those who had participated in destroying an innocent woman's reputation through malicious gossip and deliberate character assassination. His demeanor carried the controlled intensity of a predator approaching long-awaited prey, his usual diplomatic restraint replaced by righteous anger that transformed his elegant features into something approaching dangerous as he moved through the crowd with purposeful determination toward the evening's hostess and the platform from which important announcements were traditionally made. The Duchess of Marlborough, recognizing the significance of his approach and the gravity of his expression, granted him permission to address the assembled guests with the kind of curious anticipation that suggested she suspected drama but could not imagine its true nature or devastating scope. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sebastian began, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet ballroom, as conversation ceased and attention focused upon the unexpected interruption of evening's planned entertainment. "I come before you tonight to address matters of truth and justice that concern not only my own reputation, but the character of someone who has suffered grievously from the malicious falsehoods that have circulated through our society during recent weeks." His opening words created an electric tension that rippled through the crowd as guests recognized that they were about to witness something unprecedented in the carefully choreographed world of aristocratic social gatherings, where such direct confrontations were typically avoided in favor of subtle maneuvering and diplomatic resolution. Sebastian's systematic presentation of evidence proceeded with prosecutorial thoroughness, each piece of documentation and testimony building toward an inevitable conclusion that would leave his opponents with no possibility of denial or deflection. His legal training and political experience combining to create an argument that demolished Lady Arabella's credibility while simultaneously vindicating Miss Imogen's character through irrefutable proof rather than mere assertion. The forged letters, displayed alongside genuine samples of handwriting that revealed their fraudulent nature, provided physical evidence of deliberate deception, while sworn statements from the forgers themselves, men whose cooperation Sebastian had secured through a combination of financial incentive and legal pressure, confirmed Lady Arabella's role in orchestrating the scandal with cold-blooded calculation that shocked even society's most cynical observers. Lady Arabella's transformation from confident beauty to cornered criminal occurred with stunning rapidity as Sebastian's evidence accumulated beyond any possibility of explanation or excuse, her face cycling through expressions of disbelief, fury, and ultimately defeat as she recognized that her carefully constructed plot had not only failed, but had exposed her to the same social destruction she had intended for her rival. The shockwaves that followed Sebastian's public vindication of Miss Imogen reverberated through London society with the force of an earthquake, overturning established assumptions and forcing wholesale reassessment of recent events that had been accepted as confirmed fact by those whose judgment was supposedly beyond question or error. Lady Arabella Thornfield, her reputation destroyed beyond any possibility of repair, faced immediate social exile as former friends and admirers rushed to distance themselves from association with someone capable of such calculated cruelty and deception. Their abandonment of her as swift and complete as their previous support for her campaign against Miss Imogen had been enthusiastic and unquestioning. The revelation that society's acknowledged beauty had been willing to destroy an innocent woman through forgery and character assassination for the sake of securing a marriage proposal shocked even the most worldly observers, who had assumed that such extreme measures belonged to Gothic novels rather than drawing-room reality, despite their familiarity with social competition and matrimonial scheming. Those who had participated in spreading the malicious gossip about Miss Imogen found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having repeated proven falsehoods with self-righteous authority, their embarrassment compounded by the realization that they had been manipulated by someone they had trusted as a reliable source of information about social developments and moral standards. Society's capacity for rapid narrative reversal, always remarkable in its speed and completeness, transformed Miss Imogen from social pariah to sympathetic victim overnight, with the same voices that had condemned her intellectual pretensions now praising her dignity under persecution and her refusal to defend herself through counterattack against her tormentors. The rehabilitation of her reputation proceeded with gathering momentum as influential hostess competed to demonstrate their enlightened appreciation for qualities that had previously been dismissed as unfeminine peculiarities. Their suddenly discovered admiration for female scholarship and philosophical discourse, revealing the extent to which social opinion followed fashion rather than conviction in matters of moral judgment and personal character. Sebastian's masterstroke came in his decision to channel society's newfound respect for Miss Imogen into concrete action that would provide her with independent standing and purpose, while simultaneously advancing causes he had long supported through his parliamentary activities and private philanthropy. The establishment of the Fairweather Foundation for Female Education, announced with great fanfare at a specially convened gathering of political and social leaders, represented revolutionary thinking in its acknowledgement that women's intellectual capabilities deserved serious cultivation and professional application rather than merely ornamental display in drawing-room accomplishments. Miss Imogen's appointment as the Foundation's first director provided her with social position that transcended the limitations of family background or marriage prospects, creating unprecedented precedent for female professional authority that would influence generations of women seeking meaningful alternatives to domestic dependence and social decoration. The Foundation's mission, encompassing everything from basic literacy programs for working women to advanced scholarships for exceptional students, reflected both Sebastian's progressive political philosophy and his absolute confidence in Miss Imogen's administrative capabilities and intellectual judgment, demonstrating to society that his support for her went far beyond romantic sentiment to include genuine respect for her abilities and potential contributions to important social causes. The orchestration of Sebastian's marriage proposal demonstrated the same careful attention to detail and understanding of character that had marked his successful resolution of the scandal that had temporarily separated them, with every element calculated to appeal to Miss Imogen's particular sensibilities and intellectual interests, rather than following conventional romantic formulas that might have impressed other women but would have failed to move someone of her unique disposition and values. The advance copy of Edmund Burke's newly published Reflections on Natural Rights a philosophical treatise that Miss Imogen had mentioned wanting to read during one of their early conversations about political theory and social philosophy, arrived at the Fairweather residence through Sebastian's personal secretary, with a note explaining that the Duke had secured an early edition through his connections with the publisher and hoped she would find its arguments stimulating and worthy of discussion. The proposal letter itself, discovered by Miss Imogen when she opened the volume to begin reading, demonstrated Sebastian's perfect understanding of her character through its combination of intellectual argument and emotional appeal, acknowledging her independence of mind while making clear that his desire for marriage stemmed not from conventional romantic sentiment, but from deep appreciation for her unique qualities and recognition of their intellectual compatibility. My dearest Imogen, the letter began with the kind of direct address that characterized their most intimate conversations. I write to propose not merely marriage, but partnership in the truest sense, a union of minds and hearts that will enhance both our lives through shared purposes and complementary strengths, rather than the subordination of one to the other that characterizes most matrimonial arrangements of our time and social position. His systematic presentation of marriage as collaboration rather than conquest reflected months of observation and thought about her particular concerns regarding feminine independence and intellectual fulfillment, addressing her fears about losing identity through matrimonial submission while offering positive vision of enhanced possibility through genuine partnership with someone who valued her capabilities rather than viewing them as threats to masculine authority. I ask you to become my Duchess, not despite your unusual accomplishments, but because of them, recognizing that our marriage will benefit from your wisdom, your compassion, and your remarkable ability to see truth clearly, even when it challenges conventional assumptions or comfortable prejudices. He continued with the kind of specific appreciation that proved his attention to her individual qualities rather than generic feminine virtues that could apply to any suitable candidate for ducal marriage. The letter's conclusion combined personal vulnerability with practical assurance, acknowledging the risks they would face together while expressing confidence in their ability to create happiness through mutual respect and shared commitment to causes larger than their individual interests or social advancement. Their engagement announcement, delivered at a carefully chosen gathering of family members and closest friends, rather than the grand public spectacle that might have been expected for ducal nuptials, reflected their shared preference for genuine sentiment over social performance and their mutual understanding that their love had already survived more public scrutiny than most marriages ever faced. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenshollow, recognizing that further opposition would be both futile and potentially damaging to her own position within the family hierarchy, chose to accept defeat with dignity that surprised those who had expected continued resistance to what she still privately considered an unsuitable match, despite its obvious permanence and her grandson's unwavering determination. Mrs. O'Toole, Fairweather's initial overwhelm at her daughter's social elevation gradually gave way to genuine appreciation for Sebastian's devotion and character as she observed his consistent respect for Imogen's opinions and his obvious delight in her intellectual companionship, finally understanding that her daughter had achieved something far more valuable than advantageous marriage through securing genuine love and partnership with someone capable of appreciating her true worth. The wedding of Sebastian Blackwood, 5th Duke of Ravenshollow, to Miss Imogen Fairweather took place on a crisp October morning at St. George's, Hanover Square, with all of fashionable London assembled to witness an event that had generated more speculation and interest than any matrimonial ceremony in recent memory. The ancient church, with its soaring columns and magnificent altar, provided a setting worthy of ducal nuptials while maintaining the dignity appropriate to a sacrament that would unite two people whose courtship had already challenged social conventions in ways that promised an equally unconventional marriage. Society had gathered not merely to observe the ceremony, but to pass judgment on how the unusual bride would acquit herself in her first official appearance as a duchess, their collective gaze carrying the weight of accumulated curiosity about whether Miss Imogen would prove capable of fulfilling the demanding role that birth and breeding typically prepared women to assume without conscious effort or visible strain. The bride herself, radiant in ivory silk that emphasized simplicity over ostentation, moved down the aisle with quiet grace that reflected her natural dignity rather than studied deportment, her choice of modest elegance over elaborate display already signaling the tone she intended to set as the new Duchess of Ravenshollow. Her gown, designed by London's most fashionable modiste, but executed with restraint that avoided the excessive ornamentation favored by many brides of her new station, spoke of confidence in her own worth rather than need to overwhelm observers through sheer magnificence of dress and accessories. The simple coronet of pearls that held her veil, borrowed from the dowager's collection in gracious acknowledgement of family tradition, provided the only jewelry beyond the sapphire engagement ring that had belonged to Sebastian's great-grandmother, a woman renowned for her intelligence and charitable works, whose memory seemed appropriate for the occasion. Sebastian's transformation as he watched his bride approach demonstrated the complete abandonment of his usual diplomatic reserve, his face illuminated with joy so transparent that even the most cynical observers found themselves moved by the obvious depth of his affection and anticipation. The ceremony itself proceeded with traditional Anglican dignity until the moment when, instead of conventional readings from Corinthians or Ephesians, the couple's chosen passage from John Stuart Mill's essay on intellectual partnership created a stir that rippled through the assembled congregation like wind across water. Let there be for each of them, before marriage, a completely independent existence, Imogen read with quiet conviction that silenced even the most determined skeptics through the beauty of sentiment that elevated romantic love beyond mere emotional attachment to encompass intellectual and spiritual communion. The unconventional choice initially prompted murmurs of surprise and disapproval from traditionalists who expected familiar, scriptural passages about feminine submission and masculine authority. But the eloquent expression of partnership based on mutual respect and shared purposes gradually won over listeners who recognized the sincere commitment underlying the couple's desire to pledge themselves to something higher than conventional matrimonial arrangements. The wedding breakfast that followed at Ravenshollow House established patterns that would characterize the new Duchess's approach to entertaining throughout her tenure, combining intellectual discourse with elegant hospitality in ways that challenged guests' expectations, while providing genuine enjoyment for those prepared to engage with something more stimulating than typical social pleasantries. The gathering included an unusually diverse assembly of guests that reflected both Sebastian's political connections and Imogen's commitment to recognizing worth regardless of social station, from cabinet ministers and parliamentary colleagues to modest country neighbors whose presence at ducal celebrations would have been unthinkable under previous regimes, but who found themselves welcomed with genuine warmth that made their elevated circumstances comfortable rather than intimidating. Conversation at the various tables ranged from agricultural innovations and educational reform to philosophical questions and literary criticism, with the new Duchess moving effortlessly between groups to ensure that every guest felt included in discussions suited to their interests and capabilities rather than being relegated to polite but meaningless exchanges about weather and health. Her ability to draw out the shy and include the overlooked while maintaining appropriate dignity demonstrated natural grace that needed no coaching from etiquette masters or social mentors, suggesting that her unconventional background had actually prepared her better for genuine hospitality than years of formal training in aristocratic pretension might have accomplished. Sebastian's obvious pride in his wife's performance, evident in his frequent glances toward her and his spontaneous smiles when her laughter rang across the room, provided clear evidence that his choice had been vindicated by results that exceeded even his optimistic expectations about their partnership's potential for mutual enhancement and shared satisfaction. The Dowager Duchess, observing from her position of honor at the head table, found herself gradually warming to the young woman whose intellectual gifts were proving to complement rather than compete with the social graces necessary for successful aristocratic entertaining, her initial skepticism about unconventional choices giving way to grudging admiration for effective innovation that improved upon established patterns without abandoning their essential purposes. 5 years after their wedding, the transformation of both the ducal household and the Duke himself had become legendary throughout London society, with the Duchess of Ravenshollow's influence extending far beyond domestic management to encompass political strategy, social reform, and cultural innovation that had elevated the family's reputation to unprecedented heights of respect and influence. The Duchess's weekly salons at Ravenshollow House had become the most sought-after invitations in London, not merely for their elegant appointments or distinguished guest lists, but for the quality of discourse that attracted the era's leading thinkers, writers, and reformers to engage in conversations that shaped public opinion and government policy through informal but powerful networks of intellectual exchange. Sebastian's political career had flourished under Imogen's strategic guidance, her insights into human nature and social dynamics proving invaluable in navigating parliamentary complexities that required understanding of personality as much as principle, while her ability to identify talented individuals regardless of their social origins had expanded his circle of advisors and allies beyond traditional aristocratic networks. The couple's estate management had similarly benefited from Imogen's administrative capabilities and innovative thinking, with agricultural improvements and tenant welfare programs becoming models that other landowners studied and emulated throughout England, proving that intellectual partnership could produce practical benefits as well as personal satisfaction for those willing to abandon conventional divisions of masculine and feminine spheres. Their marriage had been blessed with 2 children who reflected the best qualities of both parents while developing distinct personalities that promised future contributions to society's improvement rather than mere perpetuation of aristocratic privilege without purpose or achievement. Lady Catherine Blackwood, now 4 years old, demonstrated her mother's serious-minded approach to learning, combined with an early fascination with books and ideas that suggested she would follow in Imogen's intellectual footsteps, while hopefully avoiding the social obstacles that had once threatened to prevent her mother's happiness and fulfillment. Lord James Blackwood, the heir to the dukedom at 2 years of age, displayed his father's determined character along with an engaging charm that won hearts wherever he appeared, his obvious intelligence and natural leadership suggesting that the next generation of Blackwoods would continue the family's tradition of public service while building upon the innovations that Sebastian and Imogen had introduced to aristocratic responsibility and social consciousness. The scene that would conclude their story unfolded at yet another grand ball, this one hosted by the Duchess of Ravenshollow herself in the magnificent ballroom of the family's London mansion, where crystal chandeliers cast their glittering light upon an assembly that included not only society's traditional elite, but also the scholars, writers, and reformers who had become regular fixtures at ducal entertainments under Imogen's innovative leadership. The evening's festivities proceeded with the elegant efficiency that had become the Duchess's trademark, combining intellectual substance with social pleasure, in ways that satisfied both serious-minded guests seeking meaningful discourse and fashionable attendees requiring elegant entertainment worthy of their elevated status and discriminating tastes. As the evening reached its height, Imogen noticed a young woman seated alone in a corner alcove, absorbed in reading despite the swirling activity around her. the sight triggering memories of her own wallflower days, when books had provided refuge from social complexities that seemed designed to exclude rather than embrace those whose interests diverged from approved feminine pursuits. Instead of ignoring the solitary figure as social protocol might suggest, the Duchess approached with genuine interest and natural warmth that had characterized her own personality long before title and position required gracious behavior toward all guests regardless of their entertainment value or social significance. "Ah, Miss Austen," she observed, noting the leather-bound volume that occupied the young woman's attention. "Which of her heroines do you find most compelling, and why do you think her particular struggles resonate with contemporary readers seeking guidance in navigating social expectations and personal desires?" The question, delivered with the same intellectual curiosity that had first attracted Sebastian's attention years earlier, immediately engaged the surprised reader in exactly the kind of substantive conversation that Imogen remembered craving during her own years of social invisibility and intellectual isolation. The cycle of recognition and encouragement that had transformed Imogen's life now found expression in her deliberate efforts to identify and nurture other brilliant women whom society might otherwise overlook or dismiss, her position as Duchess providing platform and resources to create opportunities that would allow feminine intellectual gifts to flourish rather than wither under social constraints and conventional expectations. Sebastian, observing from across the room where he had been discussing parliamentary matters with several colleagues, felt the familiar surge of love and admiration that had drawn him to the intellectual beauty who had transformed from observer to participant, from wallflower to duchess, while retaining the essential qualities of curiosity, compassion, and genuine engagement with ideas that had made her extraordinary long before titles and social position had provided external recognition of her inherent worth. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom in a moment of perfect understanding and shared satisfaction, their love story having evolved from unexpected attraction to deep partnership that encompassed not only personal happiness, but meaningful contribution to society's improvement through the kind of collaboration that honored both individual gifts and mutual devotion in service of purposes larger than themselves.